He had the kind of face that belonged to another time, hard-edged, confident, and quietly daring. When Rory Calhoun stepped into a frame, you didn't just see an actor, you saw the ghost of the American frontier itself. But behind the calm, rugged charm, there was a story few ever heard. A story about rivalry, redemption, and one man he admired more than any other, a man named Randolph Scott. For decades, Calhoun never spoke of him, not a word, until near the end of his life, when the truth finally came out. What he revealed stunned everyone who thought they knew these two legends. Rory Calhoun wasn't born a Hollywood star. He was born Francis Timothy McCown in Los Angeles in 1922, a restless, angry boy growing up in the long shadows of the Great Depression. His father struggled to keep the family afloat, while his mother tried to raise a son who refused to follow the rules. By the time most kids his age were worrying about school, Rory was already running the streets, stealing cars, getting into fights, and daring the world to stop him. One night when he was barely a teenager, the law finally did. Caught for auto theft and robbery, he was sent away to a federal reformatory, a place that should have broken him. Instead, it built the fire that would later make him unforgettable. Those who met him years later said you could still see it, that flicker of danger in his eyes. The kind of energy you can't fake, the kind that Hollywood would one day pay millions to capture. When he got out, he drifted through jobs, mechanic, logger, cowboy, surviving on instinct and grit. But fate was waiting for him in the most unexpected way. One afternoon while working near a movie set, he met a man who would change his life forever, Alan Ladd. Ladd saw something in the tall, broad-shouldered young man, something raw, magnetic, and untamed. He introduced Rory to his wife, Sue Carroll, a talent agent with an eye for hidden gold. She didn't just give him a chance, she gave him a new name, Rory Calhoun. It sounded heroic, it sounded like destiny. Hollywood ate him up. With his natural athleticism, deep voice, and that piercing stare, Calhoun was built for the westerns that dominated the 1940s and 50s. He didn't just act the part, he lived it. He knew how to ride, how to rope, how to survive a storm without flinching. Directors loved that he never faked a scene. When he played a cowboy, audiences believed it. They weren't watching a performer, they were watching the real thing. In the Red House, in River of No Return opposite Marilyn Monroe and Robert Mitchum, and in dozens of films that defined an era, Rory became the embodiment of the strong, silent hero. But the truth was, he wasn't as silent as he looked. Behind that calm smile, he had opinions, passions, and grudges, and one of them had to do with a man who had already become a legend long before Rory arrived, Randolph Scott. Randolph Scott was Hollywood royalty. Tall, aristocratic, and impossibly poised, he was the kind of man who didn't need to prove anything. Born in 1898, he was older than most of his Western co-stars, a gentleman cowboy who seemed carved out of stone and Southern manners. While Rory had clawed his way out of reform schools, Scott had studied engineering, golfed with Cary Grant, and walked onto sets as if the West had been built for him personally. To Calhoun, Scott was everything he was not: calm, controlled, respected by everyone from studio heads to extras. Their worlds collided in the 1950s when Hollywood was ruled by the Western. Studios churned out cowboy films faster than audiences could watch them, and every rugged leading man wanted his piece of the frontier. Rory was the wild up-and-comer, the one with raw power and danger. Scott was the seasoned veteran, the quiet storm, and although they never feuded publicly, everyone knew there was tension. Producers whispered about which cowboy the audience trusted more. Publicists compared their box office draws, and fans argued over who looked more like the real hero of the West. In private, Rory admitted something he never said aloud back then. He admired Randolph Scott deeply, and it drove him crazy. Scott made everything look effortless. When Rory fought to deliver a scene with grit and intensity, Scott would walk in, say 3 words in that calm, steady voice, and somehow own the moment. Rory once joked that Scott could stand still in a field for 10 minutes and still make it feel like cinema. He didn't need to act like a cowboy, Rory later said. He was one. He carried himself with this quiet dignity, like he was born in the saddle. You couldn't fake that. But admiration has a shadow. For a man like Calhoun, Passionate, restless, constantly proving himself, Scott's calm perfection was a mirror that reflected every insecurity. Rory would tell friends that Scott was the kind of actor who made you feel like you were trying too hard. And in those early years, maybe he was. Hollywood wanted Rory to be the next big thing, but there was always this invisible yardstick, and that yardstick was Randolph Scott. As the Texan hit television screens in 1958, Rory finally found his own stride. For 2 years, he became a weekly fixture in American homes, bringing that same authenticity that had once intimidated him. People didn't just watch him, they believed him. He had grown from the reckless outlaw to the reliable hero. Yet even at the height of his fame, when magazines called him the real deal, Rory couldn't escape comparisons. "He's got Scott's walk," one critic wrote, "but not Scott's silence." That line haunted him for years. And still, Calhoun refused to speak ill of the man. When reporters tried to stir drama, he'd dodge the question. "Randolph's a real cowboy," he'd say simply, then change the subject. It wasn't diplomacy, it was respect, mixed with something he didn't quite understand himself. Randolph Scott, meanwhile, was living like no one else in Hollywood. While others chased fame, he built a sanctuary, a sprawling ranch outside Los Angeles, where he spent his days riding horses, raising cattle, and avoiding the gossip of the city. He was private to the point of mystery. He rarely gave interviews. He didn't attend premieres unless he had to. He didn't need the spotlight, and somehow that made him shine even brighter. People called him the gentleman cowboy, but those who knew him said the word gentleman didn't do him justice. He was disciplined, stoic, grounded. To Rory, who lived fast and loud, that lifestyle seemed almost mythical. He didn't care about applause, Calhoun said later. He was the applause. Hollywood is a place where image is everything, and few managed theirs better than Randolph Scott. He never had a public scandal, never threw tantrums on set, never let ambition turn him cruel. Even his rivals couldn't find a bad word to say about him. When gossip columnists tried to dig up dirt, they found nothing. And in a town built on pretense, that kind of integrity was terrifying. It made the others, including Rory, question whether the persona they built could ever truly match the man they wanted to be. As the years rolled on, that quiet rivalry became an unspoken bond. Rory began studying Scott, not as a competitor but as a mentor from afar. He noticed how Scott treated people, from producers to the lowest-paid crew member, with the same level of respect. "He never acted like the star," Rory once said. "He acted like part of the team." It changed how Rory behaved on his own sets. He stopped trying to impress everyone and started leading with calm confidence. And audiences noticed. There was something new in his performances, a maturity that hadn't been there before. Hollywood shifted again in the late 60s. The golden age of the Western began to fade. New heroes emerged, louder, grittier, younger. But Randolph Scott didn't fight the change. He quietly retired after his last film, Ride the High Country, and disappeared from the public eye. No farewell tour, no interviews, just gone. He rode off into his own sunset, Rory said years later. No scandals, no noise, just peace. That's real strength. For Rory, that graceful exit said more than any award ever could. He understood now that fame was like a wild horse, thrilling when you first catch it, but dangerous if you try to hold on too long. Randolph once told me, Rory recalled, "Don't ever chase fame. It runs faster than any horse, and if you catch it, it'll buck you off." I never forgot that. Every time I tried to chase it, I paid for it. Rory paid for it plenty. His personal life was as fiery as his screen presence. His marriage to singer Lita Barron was glamorous on the outside and chaotic behind the scenes. He loved deeply but lived recklessly, and the gossip columns feasted on every rumor. When they divorced in 1970, Lita cited infidelity, and in the public eye, the cowboy hero became another Hollywood headline. Yet through all of it, Rory kept working. He never stopped showing up, never lost that stubborn energy that had carried him from prison to stardom. But with time came reflection. He remarried, slowed down, and began to see the industry differently. The fame that once felt like a reward now seemed like a burden. He started talking more about authenticity, about truth, about what really mattered. And it was during one of these late-life interviews, when the cameras were rolling quietly and the questions turned personal, that he finally opened up about Randolph Scott, the man he had watched, envied, and learned from for decades. The interviewer asked gently, "Rory, was there anyone in Hollywood you truly looked up to?" He paused, then smiled, a little sadly. "Randolph Scott," he said. "He was the kind of man you couldn't help but respect. Even when he said nothing, you could feel it." The room went quiet. The interviewer leaned forward. Rory continued, his voice softer now. "There was competition, sure. We were both tall, both cowboys, both trying to prove something. But Randolph wasn't like the rest of us. He didn't need the noise. He just was." He laughed under his breath. "When I was younger, I envied how easy it seemed for him. I'd break my back trying to look natural, and he'd just tip his hat, say a line, and steal the whole scene. It drove me crazy. But the older I got, the more I realized he wasn't acting. He was living." Then came the moment that stunned everyone who ever heard the story. "You know," Rory said, "I always wanted to tell him how much he influenced me. I just never did. Back then, cowboys didn't say things like that to each other. We were too damn proud. But I think he knew. I think he always knew." The interviewer stayed silent. Rory looked down for a long time before finishing quietly, "If you ask me, every actor who ever put on a cowboy hat owes something to Randolph Scott. He set the standard. I just tried to ride somewhere close behind him." And for a moment, the outlaw who had spent his youth fighting authority and chasing attention sounded like a man at peace. It was as if, after decades of proving himself, he finally understood that strength wasn't about noise or fame, it was about dignity. The very quality he had once envied in Scott had become his own. But that wasn't the end of his story. What came next would reveal just how deeply those lessons shaped the final years of Rory Calhoun's life, and the legacy he left behind. When Rory Calhoun finally let those words slip, "I think he always knew," it wasn't just a confession, it was a release. The kind of truth a man carries for a lifetime, then finally lets go of when he's ready to make peace with it. For a man like Rory, who had spent his youth running from lawmen and his middle years running from himself, honesty had become the rarest kind of courage. After that interview, people noticed a change in him. He wasn't as fiery, not as restless. He laughed more easily, spoke more slowly, and spent more time reflecting on the years that had passed. Hollywood was different now. The old westerns were gone, replaced by slicker heroes and bigger explosions. But to the few who remembered that golden age, Rory Calhoun was still a living emblem of what real masculinity used to look like. A man of grit, grace, and contradiction. In the early 1980s, after decades of living in the public eye, Rory quietly remarried his ex-wife, Sue Rhodes. The two had divorced once before, but time had softened the edges of their pride. "You can go through a lot with a person," he once said, "and still find your way back if the love's real." That second marriage wasn't glamorous or public. It was peaceful. They lived simply, often traveling between California and the countryside, spending afternoons talking about the past and the strange turns life takes when you least expect it. Gone were the days of premieres and red carpets. Rory found comfort in quieter things, feeding horses, watching old movies, sharing stories with friends. But what people around him remembered most was how he talked about the men who shaped him. When he spoke of Randolph Scott, his tone always carried the same mix of admiration and melancholy. "He did it right," Rory would say. "He lived clean, worked hard, and left the stage before it could chew him up." In Hollywood, that was almost unheard of. Most actors kept fighting for attention until the very end. But Randolph Scott had walked away with dignity, refusing to let fame define him. And that, perhaps more than any role, was what Calhoun envied most. By the late 1980s, the years of hard living began to catch up with Rory. Decades of smoking and the long grind of film sets under relentless California heat had taken their toll. His breathing became heavy, his steps slowed. Doctors diagnosed him with emphysema, a disease that steals a man's strength little by little, making every breath feel like a battle. Still, Rory refused to complain. He'd show up to events, smile for photos, and joke about it. "Cowboys don't quit," he'd say with a grin. But behind closed doors, he was facing the toughest fight of his life. He never lost his humor, though. Friends would visit and find him sitting on his porch, puffing his chest like the same rebel he'd always been. "If I can't ride anymore," he joked once, "I'll just tell the horse what to do from here." That was Rory, stubborn, funny, unbreakable. Even illness couldn't steal that spark. But under the laughter there was reflection. He talked more about legacy, about what it really means to be remembered. "You know," he told a friend, "we spend our lives chasing the spotlight, but the light that matters is the one you leave behind in people's hearts." When the conversation turned to Randolph Scott, Rory's eyes softened. Scott had passed away in 1987, quietly, just as he had lived. No tabloid headlines, no grand statements, just peace. Rory felt it deeply. "When I heard he was gone," he said quietly, "it hit me harder than I thought it would. You think men like him will live forever, but maybe he did, in a way. Every Western I ever made after meeting him, a piece of him was in it." He paused for a moment and smiled faintly. "I guess he rode off first, and I'll catch up later." For a man who had spent so much of his youth trying to outrun trouble, it was the first time he sounded like someone ready to slow down. He had made peace with his past, the mistakes, the scandals, the restless drive for success. He'd turned his own chaos into wisdom. And that was the real story. Rory Calhoun, the Hollywood bad boy who once made headlines for all the wrong reasons, ended his life not with noise but with gratitude. He often said that if not for the struggles, he never would have learned to value the calm. "The outlaw years taught me toughness," he admitted, "but men like Randolph Scott taught me grace." In those final years, he stayed close to family. His daughters, Cindy, Tammy, and Lori, visited often. They'd sit beside him, laughing about old stories from movie sets about the time he fell off a horse mid-scene and finished the take anyway, or when a director yelled, "Cut," and Rory shot back, "Why? I wasn't done being magnificent." Even near the end, he could make people laugh. He still had that charisma, that spark, that sense of showmanship that never quite left him. But his body was giving out. The emphysema made every breath a struggle, and diabetes weakened him further. Yet he never let it crush his spirit. Nurses would later recall how he'd flirt with them, joke about his cowboy days, and insist on keeping a hat nearby in case Hollywood calls again. By the spring of 1999, it was clear that the ride was ending. He was 76 years old, a lifetime away from the rebellious kid who once sat in a cell wondering if he'd ever amount to anything. But when people came to see him, they didn't find a bitter man. They found a storyteller, someone who had seen everything, done everything, and learned what truly mattered. During one of his last visits with an old friend, he spoke again about Randolph Scott. "You know," he said softly, "when I think about the men I've met in this business, all the tough guys, the talkers, the stars, Scott was different. He didn't talk about being good, he just was, and maybe that's the lesson. The real cowboys, the real men, don't have to prove it, they just live it." He coughed, took a breath, and smiled faintly. "That's what I tried to be. Took me a while, but I got there." On April 28, 1999, Rory Calhoun passed away at Providence St. Joseph Medical Center in Burbank, California. Complications from emphysema and diabetes ended his long, unpredictable journey. When the news broke, tributes poured in from every corner of the industry. Actors, directors, and fans remembered him not just as a screen legend, but as a survivor, a man who defied the odds, rebuilt himself, and carried a sense of authenticity that Hollywood rarely sees. One producer who had worked with him in the 1950s said simply, "Rory was the real deal. No act, no ego, just a cowboy who happened to find a camera." At his memorial, there was no grand spectacle, no Hollywood circus, just family, a few old friends, and quiet music playing from one of his favorite films. A few people said they could almost picture him walking away in that signature slow stride, head high, hat tilted, the way only Rory could. And in that stillness, people realized something. Rory Calhoun had lived the kind of life that comes full circle. From outlaw to actor, from rebel to legend, from envy to admiration, he had become, in the end, everything Randolph Scott had represented, a man at peace with himself. Years later, When film historians looked back on that golden age of westerns, they often spoke of the two faces of the cowboy. One was Scott, the stoic, noble lawman. The other was Calhoun, the restless outlaw turned hero. Together, they defined the spirit of the American frontier, one through quiet discipline, the other through redemption. If Scott was the man who never had to prove his worth, Rory was the man who fought to earn it, and did. That was the beauty of their unspoken connection. They represented two paths to the same truth, that character, not fame, makes a man immortal. To this day, fans who revisit the Texan or River of No Return can feel it, that flicker in Rory's eyes, that blend of strength and vulnerability. It's as if every scene carried the echo of his greatest teacher, the man he once envied but later revered. "Randolph taught me what strength really is," he had said once. "It's not the fight, it's the silence after the fight." And those words have outlived them both. Because in the end, Rory Calhoun's silence about Randolph Scott wasn't born from jealousy. It wasn't even born from rivalry. It was born from respect too deep for words, the kind of respect that only one true cowboy can feel for another. That's why, even decades after both men rode off into history, the legend of their quiet brotherhood still lingers, not written in scripts or carved on plaques, but in the hearts of everyone who ever dreamed of the Old West and the men who made it real. Rory Calhoun never needed to say much. He had already lived the story. And when he finally spoke, when he finally told the truth about Randolph Scott, it wasn't scandal or rivalry that people heard. It was gratitude. Two cowboys, two legends, two different paths toward the same horizon. One rode ahead in silence. The other followed, learned, and left his own dust on the trail. And somewhere, beyond the noise of Hollywood, you can almost see them still, riding side by side into the fading light, where words are no longer needed and where respect finally speaks louder than fame.